Hello, it's Anita Franklin again. And in this week's session around six classic plays of African theater, we're going to talk about two shows and two authors. And the first author I want to talk about is Ata Aidu, and she is Ghanaian, and she is this year 80 years old. And she, like Wole Soyinka, is a giant of literature as well as a terrific playwright. So this is a woman whose work from the 1960s on through till now is, enjoyed a career which is very rich in terms of plays, but also short stories, um, also novels, um, and poems. This is a very important part of her legacy, and how she sees herself is very much as a poet. And the second person I want to talk about is Aimé Césaire. And I put these two together, Aimé Césaire and I do, because they are both poets. So they're both people who are interested in language and in the rhythms of language and of conveying story in a lyrical, poetic kind of way. So, in that sense, the two of them have something in common. Um, when we look at Idu's work, she is known for two plays which actually predate the Death in the King's Horseman. Her play Anawa is from the 60s, and that particular play is produced over and over again all over the world. It is a play which is a classic in the sense that it talks about traditional and modern African society. So it talks about traditional mores, obligations of women and men. And it talks about the difficulty of and relevance of these traditional ideas in the context of a very, very different environment presented by the modern world and the kinds of changes that are going on globally. So often, Idu is presented as a womanist writer, someone who is concerned about Black womanhood and African womanhood and African um, rights and obligations. To what extent is African society making use of the talents, the genius of African womanhood, and to what extent has African society been engaged in oppressing some of that spirit and that talent? Who gets to choose how a woman's energy should be used? So for Idu in the play Anawa, it is about a very feisty, very decisive young woman, a woman who, although she is in a tribal situation, she's in a small village, she actually comes across as someone who is much more metropolitan in her outlook. And not only that, the play is set within the late 19th century. So you see, this is the genius of this. She has set it in the late 19th century because one of the things that she's wanting to do is to really get us to feel how unusual this woman is within her particular setting. She is supposed to marry the man who her parents want her to marry. And she says no. She falls in love with someone who she meets by a body of water. And of course, ah, she does not know who he is, and neither does anyone else. He is a stranger. But he has captured her heart, he has captured her her romantic soul. And this, again, is in the late 19th century when European colonization is deciding which bits of Africa they are controlling. So the theme of bondage is important in terms of, um, at the time, Ghana was referred to as the Gold Coast. So the theme of the Gold Coast being bonded to um, colonial powers, to Britain, that's in there. And the theme of being bonded to a man that you don't love, as opposed to being bonded to a man that you do love, that's in there as well. And then there are the bonds of culture and community and the obligations that you are supposed to fulfill. Remember, we talked about the importance of duty and sacrifice in the context of Death and the King's Horseman. So here Idu is kind of engaged in the same sort of conversation, but she has some different things that she wants to say about the whole business of duty. And she wants to say, well, to what extent is duty uh, a gendered question? Yeah. And that if we're in a modern world where our individualism and what have you is prized and is considered important, then is it only a man's individual vision that's important? Is there space for a woman's individual dreams and aspirations? Or is it always the case that her dreams and aspirations need to be subject to the control of her parents and subject to the control of her husband? Another theme which is really important in this is the theme of children and the idea of leaving a legacy. And again, we touched on that a little bit in Death and the King's Horseman. But with this, what we're looking at is the whole business of a woman being childless. And given the African cosmos, there is, one's ancestors. There are those who are here now, but we're only here for a finite amount of time. But then there are those to come. There is the continuation of society, and that there's an obligation to have children. So when this woman has married this man, this stranger, Kofi Ako, and Anawa has married him, and they are childless, then everyone wants to gossip and everyone wants to have a point of view about the way in which, oh, well, it is her attitudes which have actually contributed to her childlessness. And so with that, she becomes depressed. She becomes, in a sense, a kind of shadow of her former self. This woman who had been very kind of decisive and very sure of herself, a lot of energy. And over time, she just becomes more and more unsure, more beaten down by being childless. And she's also beaten down because her husband becomes not only wealthy, but he becomes super wealthy and is super greedy with it. So in other words, he never has enough wealth. And the wealth is actually coming from his relationship with the colonizers. And beyond that, his relationship to wealth has become even more for her, even more uncomfortable because he becomes a slave trader. So this is this is a huge, huge issue for Anawa. She is trying to figure out how to live with this man who is super wealthy and who wants her not to work and who is making money off of the selling of other human beings, um, and making money off of trading with people who are oppressors of them as well. And he thinks that he's got it covered. He thinks it's, well, I'm just partnering, But for her, she believes that there is something that is foul around this. So one of the things that happens during the course of the play, which I hope you will watch and read, because we have the materials available on YouTube, um, is she learns that actually, guess what? Childlessness is not her fault. It's actually him. He is the one who is unable to father children. And not only that, she begins to learn after all these years about who it is he might be. He is not who she thought he was. And so it's an interesting tale. And you know what? Wrote this play because it is a part of a legend. It's a part of a legend in Ghana. It's something that is a part of oral culture. It gets passed on from one girl to the next girl to the next girl. This story of the feisty, individualistic woman who, because she falls in love by this body of water, she ends up marrying someone who causes her own downfall and the downfall of any kind of unborn children that she might have had in another in another reality in some sense. So it's kind of like a tale to kind of make women listen. But again, you have to kind of really sit and watch it and think about it and think about the way in which this how you tell the story, that actually it's it isn't necessarily clear that she has brought something on herself, and that actually there are all of these other kinds of external factors and deceits that are being actively practiced onto this woman. Now, there's a lot of humor and parody and satire, but the end of this play is indeed tragic. The obligations of women in African society are revealed as complex and largely restrictive. Slavery and colonialism are huge themes in Anawa, and they feature again in A Season in the Congo, which is the next play that I'm wanting to talk about now. So A Season in the Congo is originally written in French, but as I said, Aimé Césaire is from Martinique, which is in the Caribbean, and he is a French-speaking poet and playwright, and he was very much riveted by the decolonization process, the whole process of trying to, after many generations of colonialism, to actually try and decolonize Africa and to have these independent, sovereign nation states. So he's very excited by that possibility. Remember, with Anawa, we're talking about the late 19th century. This is when, as it were, colonialism got started and nailed down uh, African countries as colonies. So this particular play with A Season in the Congo is about looking at the end of that process. And so now it's like, oh, well, now we're free. Now, what can we do? What can we do with our country? And one of the things that, again, Aimé Césaire is interested in is chronicling a real life story of Patrice Lumumba, who was the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he only served for less than a handful of months. And why was that? It was because of external issues where you have the United States and other countries in the West wanting to control this part of the world. And you also have, at the same time, incredible internal issues, internal strife. What we have to remember, those of us who are, outside of Africa, and we're not intimately involved with it, is that the shape of African countries isn't actually not been determined by African groups themselves. The shape of these countries has been determined by colonizers who sat down, negotiated, did a deal, did several deals, as a matter of fact. And so the countries that we have now, the nation states that we have now, are actually amalgamations of many different kinds of people who, well, back in the 19th century, they probably weren't that keen to be sharing resources with each other. And even now, ooh, even now, things are difficult. And so a big part of creating African nation states as opposed to kingdoms is a kind of politics which has to take into account the claims of various different ethno-linguistic groups within a particular nation. And so in that sense, many African nation states are still volatile around these kinds of claims related to resources and sharing resources within a national context. The A Season in the Congo is very much a work of poetry as well as a work of history. And that's one of the things that I think you come away with, is that A Season in the Congo, as well as Anawa, is written by poets. And so the whole business of how language is used in theater is very important. In a sense, they started with language, is what I would say, in the writing and in the crafting of these works. A Season in the Congo is something that has been recently mounted in Britain, in London, at the Young Vic. And I was able to enjoy that in 2013 with Chiwetel Ejiofor and Daniel Kaluuya as his friend, the friend of Patrice Lumumba, and rival, ultimate, deadly rival. And it was absolutely packed out. And I think that A Season in the Congo remains very rich and very prescient right now, because the whole business of the influence of the US, the influence of the UK, what the French are up to, what the EU is up to, all of this is still very, very strong, and has a way of shaping what is happening in Africa. And then there is also not only the West, one of the issues that A Season in the Congo was about, it was about the East as well. It was about the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union and the US kind of fighting and, wanting to kind of fight over the enormous wealth, the enormous, enormous wealth of that part of the world. And today, we have not only the US, the UK, the EU, we no longer have the Soviet Union, but we do have Putin's Russia, and we also have China. And so this play, A Season in the Congo, is very important for us to look at and go, hmm, hmm. And there we have it. So the next time I see you, I'm going to be showing you the slides around that. And of course, the slides will be sent to you so that you can access the material that's on there. Okay? All right. Thank you. And see you again. Bye-bye.